Let's rock and roll, shall we? So, the virus impacts on everyone, but it impacts on them differently. Joining us this week to discuss the crisis and the future of progressive politics is Lisa Nandy, the Labour MP for Wigan and now Shadow Foreign Secretary. Lisa has been a long-term friend of Compass and was a member of our management committee who actually turned up and helped us a lot while she was on the committee. She was also with Caroline Lucas and Chris Bowers of a hugely important book to us called The Alternative. She's well known for her work on towns. Indeed, she set up the Centre for Towns, and she shone incredibly brightly during the Labour leadership election. But then we always knew that she was good a long time before anybody else. So, Lisa Nandy, hello. How are you? And tell us, where are you? We're so excited to know.
It sort of feels like one of those games, like Where's Wally? Can anyone guess from looking behind me? I'm not in a prison, is the clue. So I'm actually, weirdly, somewhere in Keir Starmer's constituency. I'm not entirely sure where, but somewhere near Euston. Such is my crazy life that I came down to Parliament for a vote that never happened. And I'm now currently loitering somewhere near Euston Station, waiting to get the train home. Not in the station, I should add, otherwise I would have a face mask on.
And some security guard's going to come and move you along any minute, or
or arrest me or something.
And all that toing and froing. How are you?
It's been a difficult few months, I guess. Like everyone in the country, my family, we've had to struggle with not seeing each other. Got both parents that live alone. That's been quite difficult for all of us. We're really overwhelmed in the constituency with just the sheer number of job losses, people having to take pay cuts, people really worried about their family who are, a lot of the country is still working, has not been on lockdown. So, and Wigan is no exception to that. We have a lot of public sector and key workers. So it's been a lot, but there has been another side to it, which I suspect would appeal to you, Neil, which is that, there's been time with family and things that I've been an MP now for 10 years. I haven't really been able to do. Before I ran for leader, we also had the general election, the most bruising in my political lifetime. And for all those reasons, actually just being at home with my little boy and being able to see my family and spend a bit of time and see my neighbours a lot and feel very rooted, and that feeling of a community coming together, all those things have been really important. So my hope for what comes next is that we hold on to the things that we've discovered and remembered through this crisis, as well as correcting some of the things that we've clearly got so badly wrong over the last few decades.
Yeah, it feels like a really massive moment, doesn't it? I mean, the biggest I've ever experienced in my life, which is a lot longer than everybody else's, but it does feel tremendous, doesn't it? In all good ways and bad ways.
It just feels like a big sort of reset moment, really. Yeah. But I suppose the caution about that is that, on the left, we've got this kind of mythology about ourselves that we sort of, we came through the Second World War and we built the welfare state out of the ashes of all of that. Of course, all of that is true. And I'm very proud to be in a political party that played a big part in that. But there's a sort of sense of inevitability somehow about all of that you have these moments of crisis and then everything starts to get better. And actually, the post-war years were very difficult. Built a new settlement, which has lasted, but we've been defending it ever since. We've been in retreat for a lot of that time. We were out of power within 6 years of winning that election. There's a caution here, I suppose. The future only gets better if we make it so, and what happens next is not inevitable. It's up to us.
Yeah, and the creeping kind of tentacles of one more heave, they're always around the Labour Party, aren't they? Whoever the leader is, or whether it's a left-wing person or a right-wing person, that seems to be a sentiment that's kind of pervasive around Labour.
Yeah, I feel, a lot of the country as well at this moment has been very, very focused on their own families, on survival. And there's always a sort of feeling in Westminster anyway, in the 10 years I've been in it, that somehow what we do in Westminster has these enormous ripple effects. It's not to say that you can't use that platform for enormous good, but actually getting out into the country again, and once lockdown's over, and trying to show that there is a better path for Britain and not just an opposition but an alternative, that's something that really preoccupies me. One of the things that Keir's been doing during lockdown is these it's called Call Kia, which you can make of that what you will, but it actually is really important, where he's been getting people from different parts of the country to come together to talk to him about their priorities for the future. Seems to me that's quite an important thing to do at this moment, and particularly to do that around particular areas, because I think one of the things that's come out of COVID is that community matters, place matters to people. It's part of what anchors and grounds us, and people feel very deeply about their connections to other people, their physical and social connections. It's one of the reasons why I hate the phrase social distancing, because I actually think one of the things about COVID is that it's made us socially connect, even if we've had to physically distance, and that there's an important lesson there for us in all of that.
So just remind us what grounds and roots, Lisa Nandy. Just tell us where you come from, and and why you're the political actor that you are now.
I mean, I suppose like most people, I don't know all the answers to that, but I don't know what's the answer to that. I mean, I grew up in the 1980s, in a time that was very politically angry, and so one of the things that I saw during that time is just how much the country was battered apart by all of that. That was a lot to do with the government that was in place at the time. It felt like your government was actively working against you, not just not helping, but actively in opposition to the community that I grew up in. But there was more than that, I suppose, is that it just didn't feel like there was a serious attempt to try and bring people together. I think that's one of the reasons why I was very attracted by the messages that Compass has always promoted, and why I joined Compass long before I became a member of Parliament or even a councillor, because I've always felt that nobody has a monopoly on wisdom, and bringing people together and having more people in the room and part of the conversation is the only way that you build lasting change, and in the end the only way that you get the right answers. But I think that comes from my family as well. My dad's from India, he's a Marxist. My family spans a very wide political spectrum. My mum's Labour, my granddad was Liberal. We've got every sort of disagreement around our dinner table on Christmas Day that you could imagine. But it's important to me is that you have something to learn from lots of different places, and I think we've lost that sense really in politics over recent years. It's become very angry and tribal, and the country has suffered as a result. It's one of the reasons why I love the brief that Keir asked me to take on, because I think in the end foreign policy is about building those alliances, and we might disagree and we might challenge. Sometimes we might challenge very, very hard, but there is a wide coalition to be built in British politics that has defence of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and the best interests of the British people at its heart. And I'm enjoying the fact that we can reach out and build those alliances through the front bench.
And let's just kind of carry your life forward. Tell us what did you learn from the leadership election? What did you discover in those kind of months?
Not to run for leader.
Yeah. I think that may well be an obvious one. But kind of, what did it tell you about the state of the party or the state of the country, or how do you think differently as a consequence of going through that election?
I mean, it really is like walking through fire. I've never done anything that exposing, and it's a difficult one, because people had said, well, you couldn't possibly win a leadership contest with the Brexit position that you held. I mean, I took a position quite early on that we had to bring people together, find a deal, maintain close alliances with Europe, but respect the result of the referendum. That was an enormously controversial thing, and particularly within the Labour Party. And people said, well, you can't possibly win. Of course, I didn't win the contest, but I think really what we managed to do, I was proud of that campaign, because I think what we managed to do was to give people a sense of what politics can be. We brought people together. At the outset, nobody thought it was possible that I could win Walthamstow and Wigan CLPs. Nobody thought it was possible that the chair of Labour Friends of Palestine could win the backing of the Jewish Labour movement. We brought together GMB, the biggest energy union, with activists like George Monbiot arguing on climate change, arguing side by side for change. Only a few months after, on the conference floor, Labour had absolutely broken apart over that very issue. And so I was proud of that, and I was proud of the fact as well that we managed to set a tone and a culture that was very different. I've never seen a leadership contest where the three, finalists or the finalists in that contest quite clearly liked and respected one another. And I knew Keir very well when I went into that contest. We'd had differences of opinion over how to handle Brexit, but politically we're very similar, and personally we get on very well. I didn't know Becky as well at all, and by the end of it we'd become really good friends, and I think people could see that. And I said at the end that we were competitors in that contest, but we were never opponents. I just don't see it like that, in the same way that I don't see Caroline Lucas as an opponent or an enemy either. And I think we did something quite important for the Labour Party and quite important for politics too. So it was tough. It was really, really hard. But I think it was important that I did that and that we did that as a team. I think the Labour Party came out stronger, and I think politics came out stronger as a result.
And I kind of look at Keir, who I don't know that well, but he seems an incredibly decent, professional, hard-working person. But my word, he's going to need reservoirs of cultural, intellectual, and organisational depth in order to make the most of this opportunity. I mean, where does the party see? Where do you see those coming from in order to arm us with the ammunition and the guile we need to navigate the next few years?
Well, I think that he, one of the things that I think I knew about him before, but I've certainly got to know a lot more since I took on the brief and formed part of his team, is that he's very good at understanding what he doesn't know. It's quite an underrated quality in politics. I think there's a humility there that is important, and that he's maybe this comes from the sort of training as a lawyer, but he likes to probe the argument from every side, and so he's genuinely interested in what people have to say that is different, not just the same. I've seen a lot of political leaders, left and right, surround themselves with people who tell them the same thing and find ways of reaffirming their instincts. He's very, very good at sort of challenge and reacting to challenge, and he likes to build broad teams and broad conversations, and I like that as well. So I think there's something starting to happen in Labour that is interesting. There's a sort of factional war that we've been having in the party that I just don't think reflected the reality of most of the Labour movement. That you were either pro-Corbyn or anti-Corbyn, you were of the left or of the right, and actually, some of my closest friends in Parliament span that spectrum. The people I've learnt most from span that spectrum, found themselves on different sides of that argument, pro-Remain, pro-Leave, and actually most of us could see, the world in colour, not in black and white. And I think that's what we're starting to find again in the Labour movement. It's not that, there were parts of what happened over the last few years in the Labour Party that I think did that quite successfully. One of the things that Jeremy and his team did was to reach out to, I suppose, the slightly more radical part of the party, and they helped to bring a sort of dynamism and an energy and fresh thinking to the party that had been missing, certainly for the 5 years before that I'd been in Parliament. And it does feel quite refreshing that we've retained a lot of that, that we're not scared of that anymore, but equally that we're not shutting out people who want to challenge that and push back against that and disagree with it. So I think I suppose where it comes from is what I once heard Zoe Williams say at a Compass event, actually, which is about being porous, having more people in the room, being able to hear what they're telling you, being open and alive to all of that, and building those very big, strong networks. So in my brief, for example, we've been reaching out not just to world leaders, but to civil society as well across the world, and trying to understand not just, what's happening with Trump in America or Xi in China, but actually what the Chinese people feel, what the American people feel that is driving some of that, trying to understand the nuance and the complexity. And that can only come from having much broader networks, much deeper conversations with a bigger range of people.
Well, let's get into that a bit more, because I sort of, like everybody else, watched the scenes on our television screens over the weekend of kind of largely kind of burly looking white men protesting and whatever, and the kind of the polarization of our country on those scenes on social media. And you're just thinking, and I'm going to get slaughtered for this, but I'm thinking, like, how did those people get like that? What was it about their lives and their economic and social and family circumstances that got them to that place? And how do we begin to undo that and understand what they think, and shift the debate rather than just, polarizing it even further? And that's happening across social media, across so many areas. I mean, we'll get into the towns and cities thing, but that's another fulcrum for that kind of division. How do we develop a politics which has proper conversations and develops new positions rather than just embeds difference and that black and whiteness?
So I was smiling when you said those burly white men protesting in the streets. I thought you were talking about yourself.
Yeah, it could be.
So I mean, I suppose first of all that I think people don't know each other very well, and we've lost the ability to understand each other because we just don't know one another. It's one of the reasons why I've always had what people say are quite radical views about education. I don't like free schools and academies as a model. I dislike private education, and the reason that I do is because I think it shortchanges all kids, not just poor kids, but actually it stops young people from learning and knowing one another, and that is one of the richest things that you can, in terms of education, that young people can have. So I think there's something about that, is that, over the last 2 years, especially with Brexit, I felt like every time I would come down to London, I would meet friends who, they'd had horrendous racial abuse. They'd been told that they were liberal elites for voting Remain. They felt horribly unfairly characterised, and they felt they were losing their country. But then I would go home to Wigan, and my friends, my neighbours, my constituents would have been tarred as, too stupid to understand the question, too racist to care. They were really, really angry about being brandished uneducated because they just happened to have taken a different and quite thoughtful view about our political arrangements. And it just struck me so much that people didn't know one another. So I think that's the first thing. But I think that there's a danger that we play into these culture wars too much. We've seen a development in American politics, but in British politics as well, and right across the world, where you've got political actors, whether they're in government or civil society or opposition parties, trying to ignite culture wars in order to further their own ends. And I think the debate about the statue is very similar. In Wigan, we've been having a very live debate about statues over the last 3 years, because the only statue we have in the middle of Wigan town centre is to the only Tory MP the town's ever had. And to a lot of people, that strikes them as a nonsense when we've never had a proper monument to our mining industry. So in the last 3 years, the council responded to the level of public anger about that, and have erected not just a statue to an unnamed man, woman and child, which is important, because not to airbrush the women and children that helped to power this country and build our wealth and influence at great personal cost. But they've also erected a statue to Billy Boston, who many of you will know is one of the best rugby league players this country's ever produced, still lives in Wigan and is loved. He's also one of the only black rugby league players, certainly of that era and that generation. I think that tells you that actually this thing about, people in London or Bristol feeling very angry about statues and people in Wigan wanting to defend them, actually no, these debates matter to people. They matter all over the country, and we shouldn't make the mistake of playing into those culture wars or somehow accepting that people are fundamentally different. We aren't. And what we celebrate in our public spaces matters to all of us, and we can have a sensible debate about it with more light and less heat. And it's the job of progressive politicians to make sure that we do.
Yeah. And take that into your, let's just focus just for a couple of minutes on your work around towns. What is the new job going to help that at all? Are you going to discover different things about different towns in different countries? Are we going to learn lots more lessons? Is there a universality to this divide? I mean, seemingly at one level there's a divide which is felt greater than the recent past in terms of that cultural division between cosmopolitan and communitarianism, between towns and cities, between settlers and pioneers, and whatever way you want to cut it. And we're really keen at Compass to work out how we build those bridges and how do we build understanding. Where have you got to on that?
So a friend of mine texted me after it was announced that I'd accepted this position to say that is a lot of towns you're now responsible for. That I've taken over all the towns in the world. It's so I suppose there when I set up Centre for Towns with some friends, Will Jennings and Ian Warren, a few years ago, one of the first things that struck us was that this is not just a British phenomenon, this growing apart of two groups of people. We've been seeing it for 40 years in Britain, but we've also seen it in the USA, where fewer than 100,000 former Democratic voters in the Rust Belt put Trump into the White House. Seen it in Australia. The Australian Labor Party's done a lot of work and thinking over this. They had their own version of the culture wars, but not through Brexit, through climate change, long before we started to see it here. It's a phenomenon in France, in Germany, in Austria, seeing it all over the world. And it is really, really damaging the left as well. We just haven't known how to respond to all of this. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to reach out to understand what was happening in those places and to build those coalitions. So, for example, we've been reaching out to try and build links between some of our towns that have seen 40 years of economic decline here in Britain and some similar towns over in the United States as well, who've been hit by exactly the same global trends. I think we're facing a moment, a really huge moment, once the immediate public health crisis from COVID has receded, where the world is going to choose whether we pull together or whether we break apart. And already you can see these voices appearing on the global stage, attacking our multilateral institutions, arguing for protectionist barriers, closed borders, scapegoating migrants. There has to be another pole on that global landscape. And that's one of the reasons why we've been reaching out and building those links, those networks, those connections. It's one of the reasons also why I'm really energized about the brief, because actually this is a moment where, being in opposition, you can actually change things and be a force for good. At the moment, we've got a government in Britain that is very, I mean, it's all over the place in relation to foreign policy. It doesn't know whether it wants to be a global player or isolationist. It doesn't know whether it wants to, work with China or the US or form alliances with European partners. And I think Labour and working with other political parties has to show that there is another pole on that landscape and win that argument.
To Grace in just a second, but just the payoff line, and in part of your response, you say, "I know, Neil, it's bloody complicated, isn't it?" But that's why we called it this, because it is local, national, it's global, it's town, it's city, it's black, it's white. How do we? We need a politics that can deal with all of this complexity. Is the Labour Party able to change itself into being, the biggest tent? And we'll get on to, in the questions, progressive alliances and PR and all of that stuff. Does Labour, is Labour seeing itself as a fulcrum point in that complexity and can open out to all of those different shades?
I mean, I think that there's been I think there's an urgency to progressive politics everywhere now. I certainly felt it shift during the course of the leadership contest. I think that the December election in Britain was probably one of those moments. Talking to friends over in Australia, in the Australian Labor Party, I think they had a similar moment with their elections as well. I mean, we've been out of power now for 10 years. We've had 10 years of Tory-led rule. And the country is, in a lot of ways in a worse shape than I've seen in my lifetime. And all over the world, lights are going out for people, including here in Britain. We had this moment today where the government decided that their response to this global pandemic was just going to be to abolish our aid department. You can feel these lights going out all over the place. And it was the former Australian Prime Minister, Ben Chifley, who said that Labour has to be the light on the hill for people. And these are really dark times. I think there's a moment here where we can start to reach out and build a very broad group of people who are capable of advancing this situation. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is we've got to win. There's not going to be an election until 2024. We've got to win that election. And we've got to win that election and become a moral force again and make Britain into a moral force again in the world, a progressive force. And that means that we need to bring people with us, the broadest possible alliance. And I've always believed in that. It's not that, it's not just that I want to see a Labour government, it's that I want to see a better, different country. So yes, I think this is a moment. I think it's a really big moment. I think this is a completely changed progressive landscape in Britain than it was 4 months ago. And the challenge is, how do you maintain that over the next 4 years and progress that? And that's where I think organisations like Compass come in and become really, really important.
Okay, in terms of sources for hope, let's turn to Grace and the 100+ people who are on the call listening in, and the questions they've got. So over to them. Thank you, Grace.
All right. Okay. Yeah, lots of questions. So we'll try to get through as many as possible. First up, I wanted to bring in Jane Drapkin and also Kieran, because you both had questions which really complement each other. So Jane, if you want to go first, if you can speak.
Thank you. Hi, Lisa. Thanks, fascinating listening to you. I just wondered what your thoughts are on the merger announced today of DFID and the FCO. Do you think this is the nail in the coffin of the provision of development aid on the basis of need, and the start, or perhaps the reinforcement of aid being provided only on the basis of strategic benefit to the UK?
And then, so Kieran, if you can now speak, your question was kind of a follow-up to that, which worked quite nicely.
So yeah, my point linked to that is, I'm assuming you're against what was announced today, but I have a suspicion that many poor working class people in the UK would very much like sentiments around charity begins at home. How do we go about selling, defending overseas aid when there's huge poverty in the UK? How do we do that?
Okay, got Compass. It's like A-level maths all over again. Yeah. Thanks for both of those. I suppose, so the first part of that is around the merger. And I mean, I think if you listen to Boris Johnson, there's long been a desire in the Tory party to try to roll aid into the Foreign Office, to use it just as a tool to advance a sort of what they call Britain's interests, but really over the last decade has largely been about chasing trade deals and chasing growth. I don't think we've had a foreign policy in Britain for a decade. Our way of engaging with the world has been almost exclusively through an economic lens, and it's got us into a real mess. You only have to look at Huawei, for example, to see what happens when you take that approach. We're now in a position where we've lost our own homegrown industries around 5G. We're being squeezed in a trade war between China and the US, and we don't have the friends and alliances that we need elsewhere to deal with that. So, it's been a strategically wrong-headed approach for a decade, and I think what you saw today is the latest in a long line of that. I also think it was a very cynical move. As Keir said at the dispatch box, there was absolutely no reason for the government to make this statement today. It was rushed forward in advance of a review that is stalled for months into Britain's role in the world. And the reason that the government announced this today was really largely to distract from their own failings at home in the COVID crisis. I think it's a real problem. But, in truth, I think that there's been a lot of pressure on DFID for some time from this government in order to use aid as a tool for the pursuit of economic policy. And I think it's really important now that we stand up and provide not just an opposition, but an alternative to that as well. And Kieran, on your question about winning this argument with the public, I don't think the characterisation is right, if I'm honest. One of the things that really hit me today was that this was clearly, when Boris Johnson used the line about cash machines, the DFID has been this sort of great big cash machine in the sky, or whatever he said. It was obviously the latest version of the culture war that the Tories have tried to ignite every day now for a week on different issues in order to try to divide us from one another and distract attention from the handling of the COVID crisis. Actually, though, if you look at public attitudes in different parts of the electorate, there is a very, very strong alliance across very different parts of the electorate in favour of anti-poverty initiatives and Britain showing global leadership. In fact, anti-poverty is the one area that unites the so-called metropolitan liberals in the cities and the so-called red wall parts of the country outside. So I think the Tories are making a huge strategic mistake here, not just on this issue, but just generally. I think they completely underestimate people in the areas that they just won. I think they like to characterise those parts of the world as somehow uncaring, uninterested in what happens elsewhere in the world, inward looking. And actually, none of those things really are true. So, I think this is strategically a mistake for them. And I don't think that we should accept that characterisation either. What you saw happen today in the House of Commons was essentially a government that was trying to remove support free school meals for children in this country over the summer holidays, failed, and then went out to try and distract attention by removing aid and support from children across the world. I mean, this is just deeply, deeply cynical. I think it's going to be really unpopular with the public as well, and I think we can win that argument.
Okay, so on the subject of culture wars, there was Kathleen who had a really good question about that. Kathleen, you should be able to speak to us now.
I was really wanting to ask a question about whether, given the majority that the Tory party have, how we can get Parliament to be able to scrutinise and make the government accountable. I agree with you, the public will be incensed with the decisions they're making, but how can we put pressure on them for parliamentary processes to stop them or to try and stop them?
Well, it's a good question to which I don't have all the answers, but one of the things that I think is a problem at the moment, and it's been a problem over the last few months, is that Parliament hasn't really been sitting. And when I say sitting, I don't mean this bizarre conga that Jacob Rees-Mogg set up, where we all prance around in circles for hours, pretending that that's somehow democratic scrutiny. But actually, even when we had the hybrid system set up, where people could beam in from across the country to ask questions, the parliamentary sitting time was very abridged for no good reason, actually, because it's not like this government has a huge legislative agenda that it's trying to push through for the benefit of Britain. So we've been fighting a lot of those battles. Labour hasn't been alone in that. We've been working with other political parties to do it. It sounds boring to the public, but it's actually really, really important. I think you'll see a lot of that cross-party working in this Parliament as well. Certainly, when it was announced that DFID was being abolished and merged with the Foreign Office today in the Chamber, there was a huge sort of cross-party move to try to oppose that. So I think you will see more of that cross-party working. I think that's really important. I think we're going to have to think about tools not just in Parliament but outside of Parliament as well. I mean, we've been running a campaign to try and get the government to take seriously the fact that there were children who are about to go starving hungry over the school holidays in this country because of COVID and school closures. And, we had an opposition day debate. We had a vote that we were going to push to the vote at 7 o'clock this evening. We were expecting to lose it, but we were going to do it because it was the right thing to do. And then all of a sudden you have this amazing young footballer who stands up and morally shames the Tories into action, gives voice to something that people feel very, very deeply out there in the country. And within hours, the government has had to cave in to pressure from us, from their own backbenches, from other political parties, but most of all from this groundswell that he managed to ignite. So I think we're just going to have to think much more creatively about how we take these things on and win them over the next few years.
Okay, so next up I had James Cracknell, who I think will ask a question. Can you speak? Yeah, okay, we've got James. Go for it.
Thank you. Hi, Lisa. Both yourself and Keir Starmer have talked positively about voting reform, but without explicitly committing the Labour Party to proportional representation. What is holding the party back from making that commitment, and what can we do to persuade you?
So I think there are mixed views within the Labour Party as a whole. There are some very strong proponents of proportional representation, but there are also people who are concerned about it. I have had concerns about it. I have concerns about first past the post as well, because I think it needlessly divides us from one another on the progressive side of politics. But I also believe that the constituency link is important. And it's one of the reasons why I was able to hear and to understand the damage that was being done in parts of the country like mine through the debate about a second referendum, which hasn't gone away, a sort of long-standing sense that people are being disrespected and shut out of the conversation. And so when we did the book that Neil mentioned at the beginning, I'm not trying to plug it, I'm not even sure you can buy it anymore, but the book that Caroline Lucas and Chris Bowers and I did a few years ago called The Alternative, we actually devoted an entire chapter to this and the different types of proportional representation that there are, because there are some types of PR that do preserve the constituency link, and that's the sort of electoral reform that I'm very attracted to. So I think that's one of the problems, is that, you know, that if you remember back in the days when we were doing the AV referendum, that was part of the problem, because you had people in the Liberal Democrats saying, well, hang on a minute, this isn't what we consider to be PR, and so the coalition was already fractured. I think the other problem, though, and this is my concern with it, is that sometimes it's seen as a panacea by the left. I'm not saying you think this or that everybody thinks this, but it's seen as the way that we're going to fix this, rather than actually winning the argument. And actually with Brexit, I really felt that was the problem, is that for decades we hadn't even been having the argument about global cooperation, about participation with other European countries. We hadn't been thinking seriously about what reform of those institutions would look like, so that they were far more democratic, far more accountable, far less remote to a lot of people. And if we're not careful, it becomes a tool that can be used to further divide us and to exploit the culture wars, where we split into tribes and we just slug it out. Now, I'm not saying that that's inevitable under PR, but what I am saying is that we do have to win the argument. There is no substitute for that, not least because if we want to implement PR, you have to win an election, and to win an election, you've got to win under first past the post. So we've got to win the argument first before we can even get to the point where we're in a position to change things.
Okay, thanks. So zooming back out to the international, John Bloomfield, can you hear us? And if so, do you want to ask that question you had?
Hello, Grace. Hello, Lisa. I want to ask just on China. What policy should Labour be following on China, and how would you distinguish it from that Trump and the Tory hard right, Tugendhat and Duncan Smith and co. are following?
Really good question. I think that we need a twin pillar approach to our engagement with the Chinese government. The first is that I think we've seen the problems with what I think has been quite a naive approach to the Chinese government and Chinese investment over the last decade. Even last year, Philip Hammond, I mean, it seems odd to think that last year Philip Hammond was the Chancellor, but such is the speed with which politics moves. Last year, Philip Hammond, as the Chancellor, was still talking about the golden era of British-Sino relations. And actually, there is a problem with the 5G network and the involvement of Huawei, with the way in which the government has approached investment in nuclear power, and Hinkley Point is one example, but there are others in the offing as well. We haven't invested in our homegrown industries, and so we're now in a position where our own security services essentially say that Huawei, which is classified by the security services as a high-risk vendor, we're looking at that as being the only game in town. We shouldn't be in this position as a country. We need far greater strategic independence. And if there's you need any convincing about that, just look at what is happening in Hong Kong at the moment, and the way in which, when the government did finally stand up and say loudly and clearly that they were prepared to defend the rule of law, human rights and democracy in Hong Kong, China threatened countermeasures against the British government. So we've got to have more strategic independence. That is partly about building those homegrown industries here in the UK, but it's also about building alliances overseas as well, with other democratic countries, whether that's France, Germany, Italy, Spain, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, you name it. There are other powers who find themselves in a similar position. And at the moment, we're in the worst of all possible worlds, because we have no strategy at home and we have no strategy abroad. But the second part of this, and this is where I think Labour will always differ from some of the more hawkish Tory backbenchers, is that there is no global problem that can be solved without a relationship with the Chinese government and the involvement of the Chinese government. And so Labour, the country, Britain, has to have a constructive engagement with China on climate change, on COVID-19. We've just seen how important that is. And one of the things that concerns me about this debate is how it very quickly morphs into anti-Chinese sentiment. So here in Britain over the last few months, we've seen, particularly because of COVID, we've seen attacks on Chinese businesses, on Chinese people, verbal attacks, physical attacks. I think it's really important that we reiterate that our relationship with the Chinese people has always been strong, and it's always been important. Those cultural exchanges, you know, students, the work that the universities do together. And at the moment, you hear, you know, particularly with the rhetoric coming out of the current administration in America, you hear this very anti-Chinese government sentiment that morphs into anti-Chinese sentiment. I think it's really important that when you look at something like COVID, we draw a distinction between the actions of the Chinese government in the early days of the pandemic and the actions of Chinese medical researchers, scientists, and those brave doctors who blew the whistle on what was happening. They've continued to work with global partners over the last few months, even at times when it's got politically very difficult and there's been very little political support for doing so. And I think we need to draw that distinction quite clearly. That collaboration is going to continue to be important for Britain and the world.
Christopher Owen said, one of your predecessors spoke about an ethical foreign policy. Is this an idea that appeals to you?
Absolutely, restating a commitment to human rights and what Robin called foreign policy with an ethical dimension is really important, not least because we've had a decade of seeing our relations with other countries through the lens of economic growth and trade, and because actually what we've seen, particularly with COVID, but also with global challenges like climate change, is that our alliances with other countries are incredibly important. In the last few months, you've seen France stepping up to try and get a global ceasefire agreement, seen Australia leading efforts to get a global agreement around the vaccine. In the end, the only way that you defeat COVID-19 is by defeating it everywhere and making sure that the world's poorest, as well as the wealthiest, have access to not just the vaccine, but treatments and diagnostics as well. We've seen those powers stepping up. Those alliances are really important. What is the basis of those alliances? It's human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So standing up for those interests, there's been a sort of attempt to characterise that as a sort of head versus heart argument. Actually, it's in Britain's interest, it's in the world's interest to do it. It's morally the right thing to do, but it's also the only way that we're going to build a safer, more secure world.
Okay, nice. So next one, so it's Mark Jackson, changing the topic yet again. Mark, can you hear us? And if so, would you like to ask your question?
Hi Lisa, how are you?
All right, thanks. Except I'm getting some quite odd looks on this street, to be honest, but I'll plough on.
So, what are your ideas about building back better? And does it include the Green New Deal? And out of office, how do we create the momentum to get the Tories to accept it? For example, with the red wall that turned blue, how can we get them back?
So I think there's been a sort of shift really in terms of, you know, when I first started talking about towns way back in God knows when, 2016, I think, when I started talking till I was blue in the face about what's happening in our towns, there wasn't really much political interest. Now it feels very central to the whole political debate, and part of that agenda is about how do you bring people together? How do you create an agenda that works for people in different parts of the country who've had different experiences of globalization, whose economies are very different? You know, the economy of Manchester, where I grew up, is very different from the local economy in Wigan. So how do we create a future that works for both? Now, I think there is a growing cross-party consensus on the need to invest and to have an investment programme that works in all parts of the country, not just in some parts of the country. So that's a very welcome thing. And obviously the green economy is one of the fastest growing areas of the economy. So I think you might see some level of cross-party consensus on that. I'm not saying that, you know, the Tories are suddenly going to start hugging Huskies again and shouting vote blue, vote green, go green, or whatever they used to say. But I think there is a bit of consensus around that we might be able to help. Where I think there's a huge difference, I suppose, is that I think what this Tory government doesn't really understand is that the clamour for change that we saw expressed through Brexit and then we saw during the December election last year is not just a clamour for investment, it's a clamour for power. And people having the ability to shape their own lives, shape their own communities, make their own choices. You know, when I talk to young people in Wigan, last year I was talking to young people in Wigan, and we also went to talk to young people in Hastings about what they wanted from the future. And there were two groups of young people that we found in both places. One group who want to leave home, they want to spread their wings, they want to see the world, they want to get new opportunities and experiences. Very like me, I wanted to do that at that age. Another group of young people who wanted to stay at home near their families in the place that they knew and loved, and they wanted to contribute. Neither of those groups of young people felt that they had any of those choices available to them. So we failed on every single front. And I think that this is one of those reset moments where we've just got to start offering people real choices and opportunities, not the choices that we think they should have. It's one of the reasons why I've always disliked the sort of way in which social mobility is framed in Westminster. The idea that, you know, we're all climbing up this ladder towards this sort of shining example of somebody who goes to Oxbridge and then works in the city and lives hundreds of miles away from their family. If you want to do that, that's great, and that's, you know, let's give you the chance to do that. But let's accept that people have different priorities, different things that matter to them and that they care about, and let's start giving people real choices in their lives. I think COVID has been one of those moments. People have rediscovered some of the things that they'd forgotten mattered to them, and I think this is a moment maybe where we don't just reset policy, but we reset the values on which we build that policy.
Okay. I think this is going to be the last one from the members. So Finn Jensen had a really quick and simple question about progressive alliances. Knew it was coming. Finn, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi Lisa. I just wanted to ask whether Labour want to draw up some sort of progressive alliance with other progressive parties up to the next general election, and whether Labour would be willing to negotiate that some other parties might be the main candidate in one constituency, but to ensure that the progressive vote doesn't split and let the Tories in again. Or does Labour see themselves as you really have a chance to get a majority on your own without having any alliance with other progressive parties?
So good question, big tactical question, but also a values-based question, I guess. So first thing I would say is that I believe that we can beat the Tories. I believe that we can win the argument with the British public, because in the end, I think that we're a better country than the Tories would have us believe. We're an open, tolerant, self-confident country that, you know, we've seen during the COVID crisis, looks after people, looks after the most vulnerable, cares for one another. I believe that we can do better. So, you know, I don't think that we should ever approach progressive alliances from a position of weakness. I think we should approach it from a position of strength. And one of the things that I've always, you know, Caroline Lucas and I discussed it often, I've always said is that I don't believe in working with other people from different political traditions because I have to. It's because I want to, because I believe that it's better and it provides a better politics and it provides better outcomes and it provides solutions that last. I'm sceptical about pacts. We have already seen those growing up before. You know, we had in Bury North, where my friend James Frith bucked the trend and almost held his seat and did brilliantly to do so. We've seen quite long-standing cooperation now between the Greens and Labour to try and advance us there. But I worry about the fact that we're not giving the public a choice, and actually to a lot of the public that's seen as a stitch up that denies them the right to vote for the people they want to vote for. Now, there was a moment when I say all of that, but there was a moment when I went out and led the charge for a progressive pact. And that was a few years ago with the help of Neil and Compass and Caroline Lucas and Johnny Reynolds, Clive Lewis, two of my friends who came and helped us to do that. And that was when Zach Goldsmith was standing for re-election in Richmond, and having just run the most racially divisive campaign that I can remember in my lifetime against Sadiq Khan. And I felt that was a real moment. And the local party, the Labour Party in Richmond, felt very, very strongly, not everybody, it was, there was a live debate going on, but there were a lot of people in that party who felt very, very strongly that Labour shouldn't be running a candidate, and that this was one of those moments that was so important that we had to lead by example and make sure that we got Zach Goldsmith out and somebody from a more progressive party in. And so I think that level of cooperation is really important. But it's a values thing. It's not just a tactical expedient thing. It's about standing up for the sort of country that we want. But I think the job over the next few years is just for us to go out and win the argument with the public, and not just to show that we're in opposition, but to show that we've got an alternative. I think that's been one of the things that's been lacking on the left in recent years, and I think that we can prove that there is that again. In the end, people only vote left when they feel hope and optimism, not when they feel fear and despair. And that is the task at hand. I think we need to build a broad alliance in order to build that argument and make that case and win that argument with the public. And I'm absolutely determined that we're going to do it.
Thank you, Lisa. Just tell us briefly before we close two things. Firstly, just tell us about, we're trying to give a shout out and a bit of support to local projects. The Brick Project, is that a good project? Should we be supporting the Brick Project in Wigan?
Yeah, it's amazing. They used to be they used to be a homelessness charity. They still are, but they branched out into running a food bank a few years ago. And I went along, like a lot of local MPs do, you go and clown around at your local projects. I went undercover. I went in my jeans and t-shirt and worked in their back room for a bit, because I just wanted to see how it actually worked rather than the official visit. And they had me packing cold boxes, which people may not know are basically instead of a normal parcel, a lot of people in Wigan now can't afford gas and electricity. So they pack cold boxes for families because they can't afford to cook the food. So it's all cold food that doesn't need to be heated up. And one of the things that I saw when I went there was how it wasn't just the fact that they were providing this service. It was that, there was a mum with two young kids, a baby and a toddler, who'd walked a couple of miles to get there. She was going to have to walk a couple of miles back with some heavy tins. Straight away when she walked through the door, there was an apology for keeping her waiting. They said it's going to take a few minutes, hope it's okay to wait. It was just the dignity of that, that exchange, and the fact that she deserved to be treated with respect, and she was, having been passed from pillar to post for the last few weeks looking for help and not finding a closed door. And I watched her walk out of there with her head held high before somebody chased her out the door and said, "Would you like a lift back?" And I just, I think there's something magic in what happens with those connections. They're a lifeline for people, not just because of the service that they provide, but because of the way in which they do it, that very human connection. So yes, definitely, please support them.
We'll give a big shout out and try and get some money up to the Brick Project. And just finally, and you said it really, I mean, you talked earlier about lights going out, and some lights are going out, but there's an awful lot of lights going on. And we see that in Compass, locally, nationally, internationally, in a kind of age of collaboration that's trying to railing against the bureaucracy of the state, where that doesn't work, and railing against the free market. In mutual aid, in all sorts of places. Where does Lisa Nandy see hope for the future?
I guess, you asked me a little while ago about the Labour leadership contest and how, maybe it had changed me. I guess, I've always been quite hopeful and quite optimistic about things. I guess because I believe in people. That's what we are on the left, and that's, that's what we're about. But it's been so angry and so polarising, the debate inside Labour, outside Labour, over the last few years. And actually, during that leadership contest, it wasn't just everywhere I went in the country. I didn't just go and spend time with party members. Wherever I was, we went to see things that were happening in that part of the world. And the response was just incredible. So, the fact that we were interested, the fact that politicians cared, that we wanted to make things better and we were prepared to give voice to some of the things that people were doing. And the fact that I could stand in London and talk about what was happening in Worksop and people cared about it, that I could stand in Worksop and talk about the levels of child poverty in Manchester and people genuinely heartbroken and wanted to know what they could do to help. I think there's a sort of way that we've played into some of the divisions that have been artificially created in this country in recent years. And actually, I came out of that contest feeling that we are a better country than they would have us believe, and we can be that again. I did this event with, it was an interview with Danny Boyle during the leadership campaign, and it came about because I kept talking about the 2012 opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. That amazing moment where we came together, we told a story about the Britain that we have been, with all its honesty and complexity, and we told a story about the values and the future. And it felt that the country came together in a moment of inspiration and optimism, and then very quickly everything unravelled. And I said to him, where has that country gone? And he said, it's still there, it's just waiting for someone to give voice to it. And I'm just absolutely determined that we are going to be that force. And, it's why I love working with Compass and always have and always supported what you do, because I think you provide the space for that. And you provide not just the sort of, the practical debates that we need to have about how we get there, but the hope, the ambition, the dreams. And that is something that we can't ever lose, because in the end, that's what turns people out. That's what changes things.
Thank you, Lisa, Nandy, and thank you for everyone on the call. Another tremendous conversation. Thank you so much. Next week, we'll be joined by Anthony Barnett, who's one of the country's sharpest thinkers and writers about politics, the nation and the world. We're in for another treat. Until then, thank you very much, Lisa, Nandy. Go and get your train home from Euston. Travel safely. All of you, be good, keep safe, and like all of us, let's keep hopeful. Thanks very much. Good night.